I have an interesting relationship with Dark Cloud. It was the first game I ever had for the PS2. I got the system and game, along with NBA Street, which is an awesome game in its own right, and my love of the PS2 was cemented in stone. At its core, Dark Cloud is a simple dungeon crawler, and there's nothing wrong with that. While talking about this game, I'm trying to be in the mindset of a 2001 gamer and not someone who's played 23 years of games that have advanced, or regressed, since the time that Dark Cloud was released. With that in mind, let's dive into the developer, Level 5's very first game. Video games generally have two major areas of discussion, gameplay and story. Unfortunately, the story is bare bones, even for an early console game from over 2 decades ago. Let's go over the broad strokes of the gameplay and I'll touch on the story as I move through the dungeons. Essentially, the inciting incident occurs. The Dark Genie is summoned by the Nazis. Nazi! Scratch that, I mean by an evil generic militaristic guy. As the Fairy King explains after he saves you from the Dark Genie's attack on your village, you are given the power to open Atlamilia to collect Atla. Contained in the Atlamilia spheres are pieces of town and townspeople. That is essentially the bulk of the story, with some minor plot points for each different village that vaguely tie into the characters you get. To collect these pieces of Atla, you must enter the dungeon. This is where you will spend the bulk of your gameplay. I'm going to talk about the game with all spoilers moving forward, but considering this title is from over 20 years ago, I'd be surprised if anyone got agitated about it. The main character, Toan, comes from No Rune Village, and this village is protected by Dran, who is located in the Divine Beast Cave, which is the first dungeon. The dungeon floors have random monsters, chest locations, and floor layouts. The goal is to defeat enemies until one of them drops the item required to go down to the next floor. While traversing the dungeon, the floors contain treasure chests, monsters, and Atlamilia spheres. Once the spheres are open, they will not respawn when entering the floor again, but the monsters and treasure chests will. This gameplay loop is essentially the same throughout the game, with minor changes when new characters are gained. There are 2 types of treasure chests, regular size and big ones. The big ones usually contain weapons, but they could also contain a treasure clown. The clown gives you the option to select from a small and large present, and I largely never get anything worthwhile. Occasionally it's a weapon, but generally it's a regular item. Both treasure chest sizes can also be mimics, which I personally hate, but completely understand. The Mimic is a staple of dungeon crawlers, and they are definitely not missing, as some floors are completely covered in nothing but treasure chests and mimics. Floors also contain back floors, which can be opened with special items that are randomly found in treasure chests, but they are sort of uncommon, so the back floors can't be relied on. The back floors contain stronger enemies and better item rewards, which are usually weapon upgrade items, which are insanely helpful and hard to come by early on in the game. Now I want to go on to the monsters and how much I don't like them. Mostly it's because I'm not very good at games, but also because the monsters aren't really that good either. They constantly attack faster than the player can move while locked on. Now, I can hear you say, hard reset will just remove lock on and move away. And you'd be right. However, the hardest boss of the game is the camera. Oh no! Is there a way to lock on? No! Okay. Alright, get dead. Dude. Okay, so... there's gotta be a lock-on button. Even when locked on, the camera had trouble sometimes. It would obfuscate the character or monster if a wall or pillar got in the way. When unlocked, the camera had a mind of its own and stays static based on where it was before, requiring the player to rotate the camera manually to keep the enemies on screen. I'm sure it wasn't a big deal when the game first came out because it was a technology that I hadn't developed habits for, and I was younger and more adaptive than I am now. However, since 2001, camera control and movement, along with the button mapping on controllers related to camera movement, has been exponentially improved upon. The camera was the hardest thing for me in this game, and I think that's mainly because I'm now used to superior methods and tools, and because of that, I won't be holding it against Dark Cloud. And as a small note to add, here are some odds and ends of the dungeons that don't really require an intense deep dive. There is a hotbar that is used while in dungeons, and you can put items that auto-activate when triggered, or can be used when manually activated. The latter are usually attack items such as bombs and elemental gems, but I mainly use Dran Wings to increase movement speed. The former of those items are the Auto Revive, Auto Repair, and Poison Charm item. The auto items are self-explanatory, and the charm items prevent one of the 3 status effects, poison being the worst one in my opinion. There's another dungeon mechanic that is rarely seen, but it's floor effects. Some floors require you to use a specific character or cause you to get thirsty faster. Oh yeah, the game has an inventory cap and a thirst mechanic that play into the inventory management portion of the game. It's mostly just an annoyance after the first couple of floors, and becomes trivial once you get some weapon abilities. There are also pools of water randomly located inside of the dungeons that recover health and the water meter. There is one more floor effect, but I'll rant about that later. Midway through the Divine Beast Cave, a mini boss floor occurs. Playing this section today was a bit cheesy, as it is a scripted cinematic fight with a quick time event. However, the cheese sorta makes it charming. I can only imagine it was epic to me as a youngster. There is another QTE in the next dungeon, but then the mechanic is abandoned and never seen again. After clearing a few floors and you've stockpiled up some Atla, it's time to take part in the most engaging section of Dark Cloud, the city building. In my opinion, rebuilding the town and cities destroyed by the Dark Genie is the best part of the game. It allows for creativity with puzzle solving and comes with the best rewards. After restoring some of the residents of the town back into their homes, they will tell you what other items their home is missing. They will also let you know about where they want their house to be placed. Some folks want to be near the dungeon entrance to train. Others want to make sure that they aren't near other people because they are annoying. Whatever the request might be, it makes the rebuilding process fun and requires some maneuvering of the puzzle pieces to make it work. If you make all of the residents happy, you'll get a bonus reward. Also, while placing these homes around the map and adding their missing items and clearing more of the dungeon, wonder chests appear. These are treasure chests that are outside of the dungeon and usually contain amazing items, mainly the water, health, defense, and inventory boost items. 100% clearing the city building isn't required, but it is fun and rewards the player with some unique weapons that can't be acquired any other way. The only one you need to 100% complete is when you go to the moon, but I'll touch on that when we get there. Completing the individual Atla homes also comes with some very minor story sequences, but most, if not all of them, are completely inconsequential to the greater story and are basic and not really worth mentioning in my opinion. There is one requirement that is kind of annoying. I believe our mom asked to have her window facing towards the sunrise. A nice sentiment, but basically just requires trial and error. The day and night system is kind of pointless and only seems to affect the fishing minigame, which is so awful I completely ignored, which is a true shame because there's a unique weapon only acquired from fishing. But also because of the camera's limitations, you can't use the day-night system to find where the sun rises because there is no compass. An oversight by the development team, but minor enough that it can be circumvented. Continuing on through the Divine Beast Cave, you eventually save a cat that turns into your second party member. Honestly, I don't even remember if Zhao has any dialogue or reason to help you. That aside, I do think she is the best character in the game. She's a ranged character, and after a few weapon levels, she can attack very fast. Generally, I prefer ranged characters no matter what, but in the game where monsters' attacks are faster than you can move, being ranged is essentially easy mode. Toan does more damage, but the safety of being in no danger is great. Clear the rest of the dungeon and fight the local divine beast, Dran. He's been corrupted by the Dark Genie's power, so through the power of violence, we'll beat some sense into him. Most of the boss fights follow a similar pattern. Use the new character you unlock to get through the boss's shield, then smash with your strongest character. Because I'm a low IQ simpleton like this, and because games nowadays don't use design like this and hold your hand through everything, it took me a while to figure this out. For Dran, he takes flight in the arena and needs to be shot down by Zhao's slingshot. He also causes portions of the arena to fall away, which adds some environmental hazards. Upon beating Dran, he snaps back to reality and we can move on to the next dungeon. At this point, I'm going to speed through the story and dungeons because almost nothing happens until the final dungeon of the game. The second zone is a jungle biome and is run by a giant tree. The character that is added to your team uses a hammer and named Goro. His father was killed by a giant snake, and we kill that snake via a QTE midway through the dungeon. Continuing through until the end, we end up fighting an orangutan. I couldn't figure out how to do damage to the boss when I was using Zhao. Fortunately, she had a weapon equipped named Steve. Steve is amazing because it talks to Zhao while it's equipped. Because of Steve, and only because of Steve, I was able to defeat the orangutan. Steve reminded me that I could smash the monkey with the hammer to open up the boss for some big damage. Kill the monkey, the tree thanks you, and you move on. At this point, you go to a small town with space rabbits that happen to have lost an item that will allow you to go to the moon to fight the Dark Genie. All of these rabbits seem scatterbrained, and while there's nothing in terms of rewards or fights, the NPCs do offer some lore and direct you on towards the next dungeon to find the magic orb. The third zone is an oceanfront town plagued with a ghost ship that is sunken at the bottom of the ocean, which you reach with a mechanical submarine. Ghost ships are a staple of JRPGs from the early days, but normally you get to them with another ship. It's truly silly in a game where so far the level of technology has been medieval. Either way, during this town and dungeon, things really start to pop off. Shops open up that give the player access to buying all of the elemental weapon attachments and items that allow the player to enter the back floors in the Sunken Ship dungeon. We also unlock our third character, Ruby, who is a magic-using genie. She is actually as bad as a character in Zhao in terms of story. She basically only joins your team because a mob boss dumps her off on us. There's nothing related to some genie-on-genie hate on the macro scale, and she also has nothing in relation to the boss or story of the seaside town. She does decent damage and her charge attack hits for large chunks, but for my money, her attack speed is just too slow. It's about this point that some insanely annoying enemies start popping up. I'm looking at you, the Chariot. The boss in this dungeon was probably the most difficult for me as well, the Ice Queen. She puts up a shield that needs to get depleted by Ruby, and then damage done while the shield is down takes from her main health pool. The part that makes this boss difficult is that she puts her shield up after one hit while filling the room with tornadoes and shooting homing magic shots. This fight took me a while, and honestly, I didn't like it. After you clear this fight, you find out she just turned into a psychopath because her boyfriend left her at the altar. Her fiancé, who is somehow still alive after all these years, makes up with his ex, and the terror of the Sunken Ship and Ice Queen are no more. On we head to the desert, which I believe is named different things in dialogue and on the screen header. We enter the Sun and Moon Temple next to find the second magical orb required to go to the moon. At this point, if players have been working on leveling weapons up, this dungeon goes by pretty quick. Ungaga is the character you get for this dungeon, and he's a warrior who feels disgraced because the Dark Genie destroyed his village, and he could do nothing about it. Eventually he joins up after we talk some sense into him, and he allows us to pass smoke walls, this dungeon's character-specific block. I mention it because it's also the main mechanic of the boss. This boss was crazy easy. After Ungaga removes the smoke shield, I smack the Cursed King Spirit with Toan, and the boss fell easily because he essentially gets stun-locked. After defeating the boss, you collect the second magic orb and head off to the moon on a magically powered airship. This dungeon was also kind of a bummer to me because I don't think I collected a single item that allowed entrance to the back rooms, which is where all the good loot is. Yellow Drops is the name of the city on the moon, and the dungeon is just different craters on the moon. This town is the home of the Space Rabbits, and their best inventor, by the name of Oswald, is the final party member of the team. Also, Yellow Drops sucks. You can't travel around it like the other towns, and it's a giant circle, and there aren't any good markings, so I never really figured out which buildings were which. I just walked in circles checking every building after every couple dungeon floors to make sure I found all of the wonder chests. Oswald is a fun party member because he wields a gun. His gun has two different upgrade paths, one that is just a straight machine gun and the other fires elemental bolts. It's a shame you get him so late in the game because he really is fun to play. This is the last time you will be using Atla to build, and it's a doozy. Not only do you have to complete the build at 100%, but it is also a giant mecha robot. This robot's going to be powered by a sun sphere, which is super rare, but fortunately, the Coliseum on the moon has one as a reward. How lucky. We fight off Minotaur Joe and pilot the Gundam to go fight the Dark Genie in front of his giant floating castle. Upon reaching the castle, a cutscene battle occurs with the Dark Genie and the Sun Robot. It's actually not that bad, and I was entertained while watching it. We use a powerful attack to melt the Genie and think that all is won. However, it was all just a ruse. The Genie was just a mouse that was powered up by proximity to the actual Dark Genie, who was possessing the evil general from the beginning of the game. The true Dark Genie one-shots the giant robot and we began plummeting to our certain death. Dran comes swooping out of nowhere and saves our team and drops us off at the Dark Heaven Castle, the final story dungeon of the game. Upon entering the castle, we essentially get the first bit of relevant overarching story. We find out that the Dark Genie was born in the castle 400 years ago because of a mysterious white-haired figure that had maybe a total of 3 minutes of screen time previously. He explains that there was a war occurring and he was the king of one faction and that his side was losing. He makes a deal with the Lord for a power that will allow him to win the war. He uses that power and succeeds. However, that power came at a terrible cost. The king's beloved was murdered by an assassin right in front of him, and from his rage and sadness, the Dark Genie was born. The Dark Genie ravaged the world and destroyed kingdoms. The king then read a book that told him that Atlamilia would be created in 400 years' time and that it had the power to defeat the genie. With that in mind, he cast a forbidden spell to time travel to the time that Atlamilia would exist. Atlamilia is a link to a separate dimension, and it could be used to store the genie in a way. Defeating the genie is a paramount concern, as the genie doesn't want to only rule the world, but to send his power through time to rule at all times. Truly a terrifying prospect. The plan is to travel back in time before the genie was created to prevent his creation in the first place. The white-haired king sacrifices himself after explaining the plan to cast the forbidden spell once more, allowing the heroes to travel back in time to save the past and future. This dungeon, known as the Gallery of Time, has a neat concept where each floor is actually a period in time. I do know that it would be too much to ask, but it would have been nice if each floor had a different theme instead of the same dungeon template. The ALA that are collected in this dungeon slot into flashbacks. These flashbacks flesh out the story that was told to us before entering the dungeon and doesn't really add anything of substance other than explaining why he ended up losing his mind, causing the creation of the genie. The dungeon provides a decent challenge, but by this point, I had my heavy-hitting weapons built up and I was able to burn through this dungeon in decent time. With the unlocking of this dungeon, the best door opens up in the game, and it is the Fairy King himself. He sells useful items of the highest tier, acts as your storage unit, and sells all of the upgrade gems and most of the monster killer upgrade attachments. Missing from his store is the mimic and metal killer items, which is a weird oversight. And he doesn't sell any of the elemental attachment items, which kind of sucks because that requires heading to Queens to be able to buy those. I'm assuming it was some sort of memory or programming limitation that caused those items to be missing from his store, and it isn't the end of the world, but it is a bummer to be sure. On to the final boss, which has two phases. The first is decently simple, with hitting the Dark Genie target that is off the map with the ranged character, and then smacking his hands with the correct element attribute as they pop out of the ground right underneath the player. The worst part about this phase is after every hit of his hands, there's an unavoidable attack that does decent damage. This attack caused me to have to use quite a bit of my resources, and I lost this fight in the second phase on my first try. Okay, round 2.
Round 2. Fight!
I stocked up on items and Dran Wings for the movement speed increase to deal with phase 2 and got to work. This time around, phase 1 was much easier as I knew the rotation of attack. Phase 2 started and I knew the rotation of this one as well. I started by luring the unkillable skeletons to the back of the arena to be out of the way and knock them out at the times they resurrected. All the while I was running around avoiding the super strong laser beam attack. Biding my time and waiting for openings, I did big damage when I could to the main body and eventually killed the genie. He taunted me, explaining how he could live forever and that time was his domain. Knowing the inevitable, we have a cutscene where we step in front of the assassin back in time and save the king's beloved from being murdered, stopping the creation of the Dark Genie in the first place and saving the world and all times from being conquered. The credits roll and the post-game begins. With the completion of the story, a post-game dungeon opens up called the Demon Shaft. In my opinion, it was a slog. There are 100 floors with a boss at the top. There are some decent weapon rewards from chests in this dungeon, and I collected many weapon upgrade items from the chests and from the back floors. Every 10 or 20 floors, the enemy pool changed, but the format of progression was the same. Kill enemies until one drops the item that allows you to proceed on to the next floor. This is where the slog part comes in. These enemies were HP sponges, and blocked constantly, making it harder than it should have been. While this is such a nitpick on my part, I still found it odd enough to mention. When you advance to the next floor in the Demon Shaft, you go up instead of down. I just assumed that demons would be down and shafts go down, but that could just be me not understanding words and lore or attributing meaning to words that don't exist. The boss at the top is the Black Knight Pendragon, and it was decently fun. The fight consists of 2 phases, and the first he is riding his steed, which charges the player while the knight throws whirling blades of energy from his sword. Fortunately, I had maxed out the stats of one of Zhao's slingshots, and I was able to get through this phase with relative ease. The second phase caused me a bit more trouble as the knight phases right in front of the player and swings both swords while also throwing the energy while at a distance. After a few spectacularly failed dodges on my end, I just decided to face tank the knight and do as much damage as possible while expending my healing and auto-revive resources. My strategy wasn't very sophisticated, but in the end, I prevailed and defeated the knight, obtaining the most powerful sword in the game. That is the entirety of the game, other than possibly the part that I found the most fun, the weapons. Weapons are the biggest time sink in this game. When defeating an enemy, a weapon gains weapon points, which when the limit is reached, the weapon can be leveled up. When leveling, you can equip the weapon upgrades of the stats you want to increase. Gems give the best bang for your buck if all of the stats are needed, but sometimes focusing on the specific stats with targeted attachments is best. The weapon system is surprisingly deep as well, as there are plenty of abilities that can be added, the best of which is durable. Talking about durable instantly gets my blood boiling because I think that weapon durability is an awful mechanic in almost every single circumstance. I'm looking right at you, Breath of the Wild. In the first dungeon, weapon durability plays a part because of the limited inventory space and resource availability. Taking up a bunch of slots for repair powders and dedicating an auto repair powder to your hotbar at all times is a must in my opinion, because if a weapon's HP hits 0, it's destroyed. That's an automatic save scum moment, and even if you lose an hour of time, you still save time in the long run, especially if a lot of time and resources went into leveling up that weapon. The worst part about this is, there are floor conditions that cause weapons to not gain any experience for leveling. In fact, kills with the weapon decreases the XP, meaning that weapons only lose durability on those floors. Developers, adding mechanics that actively encourage players to not engage with your game is dumb. Now that I'm done ranting about durability, back onto the weapons themselves, because it really is an awesome system in Dark Cloud. There are other abilities and some of them are self-explanatory, but some are not. The abilities aren't explained at all. Thirst and Quench are opposites, but while Quench causes the water meter to decay slower, Thirst causes it to decay faster, but a drop of water is refilled with every kill. Big Bucks causes more and larger money drops, and Poison is obviously a poison tick. This poison tick is insanely overpowered as it's based on the enemy's max HP and is percentage based, so each tick does a ton of damage. These abilities are transferred between weapons by status breaking. Once a weapon has been leveled up 5 times, it can be status broke and turned into a weapon upgrade. When a weapon is status broke, 60% of the stats and all abilities are carried over. While being able to move abilities from one weapon to another is great, leveling a weapon up 5 levels is a tedious task. This is where power-up powders come in handy. What seems to be the rarest item in the game, a power-up powder instantly levels up a weapon, negating the need to gain weapon XP. My biggest complaint about the game is that power-up powders are unable to be purchased at any time. This item significantly speeds up the process of status breaking lower level weapons to get abilities from. The weapon designs are also awesome, especially the swords for towing. The slingshots, rings, and guns aren't really that visible, but the hammers and polearms are designed pretty cool as well. One of my favorites is the lamb sword. It has a hidden quality that when durability is low, it transforms into the lion sword, and the attack stat is significantly increased. I do wish there was a way to keep it in that state at all times, but after a certain point, other swords' base attack stat surpasses the lion sword. Towan also has 3 different max tier weapons, not including the Chronicle 2 sword that is a reward from completing the post-game dungeon, and the other characters each have 2. These weapons are mainly obtained by upgrading. In the weapon menu, each weapon has an upgrade button that displays which stats need to be increased to reach upgrade conditions. Once these stat thresholds are reached, the weapon can be upgraded into a new form that has higher main stat maximums. When upgrading, all previous stats are carried over as well as abilities. Personally, I love these types of systems in video games. Upgrading and strategizing the best ways to get the best items is always fun for me. Dark Cloud is clearly a relic of the past in terms of its game design and story, but what it lacks in terms of advanced methods of storytelling in games or advanced game mechanic implementation, it has bucket loads of charm. The old school JRP staples such as giant robots, ghost ships, swords and magic mixed with guns, mistranslations and typos most likely due to a short period of time before the release date are all present in this game. While I can't entirely recommend the game purely on its own merits, fans of dungeon crawlers or deep weapon systems will surely enjoy this game. I originally booted up this game out of nostalgia and the desire to complete a game from my childhood that I never beat. I stayed because I was genuinely having fun. Never come back to this dungeon ever again. Go back to where it all started. No ruined village. Thank you everyone who watched and chatted during playing this game. I really appreciate you, and I'll see you for the next game. If you made it this far into the video, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I'm not great at editing or keeping myself motivated, so it means a lot that my work is watched. If you enjoyed the video, please consider sharing it to a friend or subscribing to the channel. I promise I won't upload nonstop and clog up your subscription feed. If that didn't convince you, consider how happy it will make my 2 dogs, Kyrie and Sora. I hope everyone has a wonderful, indeterminate length of time between my next video, and I will see you all in the next one. Dran comes swooping out of nowhere and saves our team and drops us off at the Dark Kevin.